On December 11th, 1941, Germany declared war on the United States. I'm sure it was an awful Christmas that year. This is the 76th anniversary of the declaration of war. In our next conversation, we'll talk to Dr. David Conley Nelson, and he'll talk about persecution of Mormon missionaries in Germany before Hitler. Check out our conversation. I also want to remind you that we just finished our transcript on Greg Prince's interview, so please purchase that. It's half price this week only. So if you order now, it'll be there before Christmas. Check it out. Now back to our conversation. Can you talk about the time between, say, 1871 and World War I? So, 1915 or so. So you're saying it was kind of a socialist democracy, or?
Well, no, it was. It was very capitalist, and Germany was very industrial. Right from the get-go. It was probably the second most industrial nation other than Great Britain. But they, you still had a lot of government power, but then again, you had locally elected officials. The church was still pretty strong. If you were in northern Germany, the Lutheran church called a lot of the shots. In southern Germany, the Catholic Church was in charge. You paid church taxes over there. There's a remnant of that exists in modern Europe today. But in those days, if you were a Lutheran or you were a Catholic, you had to pay. Tithing was mandatory. Not necessarily.
Tithing to the German or to the Lutheran church?
To the Lutheran church, yeah.
Lutheran in the north and Catholic in the south? Is that how it worked?
It wasn't our LDS idea of a 10% tithe paid on your gross. But, and so Germany was becoming very powerful, and they led to a lot of those tensions. Germany became very militarily powerful, and a lot of tensions led to the diplomatic pacts that you had that were given a lot of the blame for provoking the First World War. The Mormons over there really had a struggle. They had a struggle over there in Germany in that period because they did have that opposition from the churches, and they did have a lot of scrutiny from the government. And then when they would finally convert a decent number of converts, they'd get on the ship and they'd come to the United States. So it was very hard in that regard. By 1910, a guy by the name of Hiram Valentine was the mission president over in Germany, and he had learned to start using the tools that other American citizens and that American companies could use in other countries. He'd learned to be able to appeal to the American consulate in Dresden, for example, when a missionary got rounded up and thrown in jail. He started being able to realize that he could go hire a lawyer. He could sue the government in court if a German meeting house was seized, or some of the assets of the church were seized. And he took a Germany-wide tour in 1910, and he borrowed the car of the U.S. ambassador, who thought enough of this Mormon to let him use his car to visit his units around there. So it was getting gradually better as the First World War approached.
So what were some of the things that these missionaries were thrown in jail for?
They were, there was a lot of scandal in the newspapers over polygamy. And not that polygamy wasn't a scandal, it was a scandal, but there was a lot of exaggeration. There were stories of German women congregants, converts, going to the United States and being enslaved in polygamous harems. There were stories of when the Utah War broke out in 1857. Of course, there were stories in American newspapers, but they got translated into German, and there was a lot of embellishment. The U.S. government is going to Utah to wipe them all out. When the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Point, and the two railroads were connected in the 1870s, 1880s. One German newspaper said that the government was doing that so they could send a train to Utah with troops to put down the Mormon rebellion. So in that particular atmosphere, a lot of local policemen would round up the Mormon missionaries. They'd put them in jail for a day and then let them loose. Or a local judge would tell them that they could have a suspended sentence and go home, charged with what, I don't know. But if they would just leave, if they would just leave the country, well, what they would do is a missionary would get kicked out of Bavaria, so he'd go to Saxony instead of leaving and going home. And a Saxon missionary, American missionary, who'd been kicked out would go to Bavaria and replace them. The Mormons also were not terribly honest about representing what they were doing. For a long time, Saxony had a ban on Mormon church activity, which the Mormons flaunted. So when a missionary came into to Dresden, foreigners always, in fact, even Germans, when they moved, they had to register with the police station within 3 or 4 days or a week of having moved and give the authorities their local address. Well, the missionaries would come in, and they knew if they registered as missionaries, they'd get arrested and thrown out. So they would say, no, we're commercial representatives. We're trying to sell local companies some American products. Or we're teachers of English. Or we're here actually as students. We want to go and apply for a German university. Or we just want to come over and learn the German language because we're American college students and we need proficiency in German because we're going to be in graduate school. And so the Mormons were responsible. They were fairly responsible for a lot of the problems that they had there. Again, they did not have critical mass. The local Germans that converted to Mormonism never really had much problem with their own government. They had freedom of religion in Germany, and you didn't have to be Catholic or Lutheran. In fact, if you were not Catholic or Lutheran, you didn't have to pay the church tax. Okay, and there were all kinds of non-confessing German German Protestant groups are called confessions that broke off from the Lutheran Church. So Germans had religious freedom, and the German Mormon missionaries, the native Germans, they were never harassed. It was the American missionary that was harassed. No Mormon missionary lost his life from 1851, when the first mission was opened, through the turn of the century. So it wasn't that bad, but they were harassed pretty well.
Okay, so mainly because, is it true Lutheranism in the north was kind of a state religion and Catholicism in the south, and so because they weren't members of them, they would just kind of harass them? Is that? Yeah,
sure. Another thing that the German authorities would say is, not only do we know that you're having problems with the authorities in America, and if you can't be good citizens of your own country, how can you be good residents of Germany? So we have to watch you, and they watch you very closely. They would say we wouldn't give you so much trouble if you we would register you as a recognized church, but you have to be recognized by a church in your own country, by the government as a church in your own country. Germany registered churches. There's no way to register a church under the U.S. government. The Mormon Church didn't apply for a license. The Catholic Church did not register as a church. And so they could not give them a certificate of registry in English so that the Germans could reciprocate and then let them be a registered church in the United States.
So that's interesting. So did the Baptist Church and Jehovah's Witnesses, did they have similar problems in Germany?
Yeah, they did. They did. The Jehovah's Witnesses really did not become prominent until the 20th century. But the Baptist Church did in that regard. But one thing that they did was the Baptists registered a lot more converts. And another thing they did was they didn't call on the German converts to immigrate to the United States. They were setting up a Baptist church there in Germany for Germans. So they weren't as much of a threat.
Oh, okay. Because they stayed right in the country.
Yeah.
Okay, and plus they didn't have the problems with the U.S. government that the Mormons had.
Yeah, nobody was sending Albert Sidney Johnson, to restore law and order among the Baptists in 1857.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. So one of the things I remember about your book was some of the mission presidents, as this kind of tumultuous time was coming for, they were worried not only about the Nazis but the communists.
Yes.
And at the time, it seemed like there was not. It wasn't decided if the communists were going to win or the Nazis were going to win.
Yeah, this is the 1930s, before 1933. Yeah, this is 29, 30, and 31, and there were riots on the streets, and even more. And the mission presidents. You had two Mormon missions in Germany at the time. You had the mission that was headquartered in Dresden that later moved to Berlin, and that was the German-Austrian mission. And then you had a mission that was actually headquartered in German-speaking Bern, Switzerland, that was responsible for the western part of Germany, and that was the Swiss-German mission. Okay. They're writing reports home. They have a reporting system that's set up by Salt Lake City. They have to send home quarterly reports, and they have to send home annual reports. The mission presidents are writing these letters home saying, we're afraid for the church with the National Socialist and the Communist battling for power in the streets. And what they were afraid of is not that the Mormon church would be closed down. What they were afraid of is that the American missionaries and they, as the American mission presidents, would be sent home. The LDS church is a very top-centric church. Rule comes from Salt Lake City and it goes out. There was a terrible situation that the mission presidents were thinking of by their own frame of reference. As it turned out, every time the missionaries went home, they went home in the First World War, they went home at the beginning of the Second World War. The German church worked out pretty well under the command of German priesthood holders and German Relief Society presidents. They did pretty well, but it was against the culture of the Mormon church for it to be led at this time by local leadership. And so the mission presidents were worried that they would have to go home.
Okay. Now, can you talk about some of the things that the Germans did? As I recall, some of the things they would do is they would let women pass the sacrament, for example.
Okay, now that happened. That happened only one time that I have a record of.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now that happened later on in the National Socialist period, but before the American missionaries went home for good. You had the Czechoslovakian crisis, which happened in October of 1938. Okay, in April of '38, you had the Anschluss. The German army marched in to Austria and took over Austria, and then in the fall of 1938, you had what was called the Czechoslovakian crisis and what was called appeasement then. The British and the French met with Hitler in Berchtesgaden, and they came up with the agreement that Germany could occupy the Sudetenland. Now the Sudetenland was German-speaking Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a creation of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Okay, it was part of the Habsburg Empire that was no longer going to be governed by Austria-Hungary. So this was what later, when Neville Chamberlain came home to Great Britain and said, "We will have peace in our time." This is the reviled, in today's viewpoint, it was the reviled instance of appeasement. They were appeasing Hitler. Hitler was going after all the German speakers in Europe. So in late 1938, Europe seems to be on a cusp of war. Hitler is threatening to invade all of Czechoslovakia unless he gets what he wants, which is the Sudetenland. Well, the German missionaries packed up and left. And they left for 3 weeks. And they went to Denmark, and they went to Sweden. And they then came back once the all clear was sounded, because at the last minute Hitler and Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister agreed simply to let Hitler have the Sudetenland. So the missionaries came back, and they found out that in a couple places at that period of time, women had taken the liberty to bless and pass the sacrament. My feminist Mormon history friends look at that as a significant happening. I don't really think it was, because the American mission presidents came back and put a stop to it. So it would have been great if it could have continued.
So this was just a short 3-week period, basically.
It was called the rehearsal evacuation, because you see, when World War II started on September 1st, 1939, the missionaries went home and evacuated for good. But they had an evacuation plan drawn up ahead of time with the help of J. Reuben Clark and the help of the serving mission presidents. And so they actually had put this into practice and had been gone for 3 weeks, came back. So when World War II broke out, they did it pretty well.
What do you mean they did it pretty well?
Without any hitches. Nobody got hurt. Nobody got...
they evacuated.
They evacuated. There was the members of what was then called the East German Mission. The German-Austrian Mission had changed its name. The East German Mission, they got on trains and they just left. Okay? They had a little bit of a problem when Holland, when the Netherlands blocked their entry, because their their strategy was to go through the Netherlands, and the Netherlands mission would, and they did that, and that got closed down. So there were some anxious moments for the missionaries evacuating Germany in the West German mission based in Frankfurt. They'd moved it from Basel, Switzerland to Frankfurt. But that only lasted a couple days, and everybody was at the end, everybody was present and accounted for, and nobody got hurt, and it worked out really well.
Okay. So while the missionaries were out of the country, the Germans...
They ruled me, except for that incident where the women passed the sacrament in a couple branches. Everything was fine. Tithing was collected. I want to say ward council, branch councils met, district council met. The German missionaries who were German citizens continued to knock on doors. The German Latter-day Saints did pretty well when the Americans went home, much to the chagrin sometimes of the American mission presidents.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. David Nelson. In our next conversation, we'll talk about how the LDS Church dealt with Jews in Germany under Hitler. We'll especially highlight J. Reuben Clark.
He did not like Jews. He could not stand Jews.
Wow.
And in one case, it didn't make the Mormon Church look very good.
Click here to subscribe, click here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some other videos that we've done here on YouTube. We hope you'll use this as a valuable resource to learn more about Mormon history.